learn to navigate your terrain. Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and today I am going to explain the hierarchy of federal documents. And just to get started, federal documents form a hierarchy because each document has a government official who's responsible for it. So the hierarchy of those government officials is reflected in the relative authority of an individual document. So we are going to go Congress, the President, DOD, and then the Army. And just because one of you jackals was like, Jesus Christ, is this guy long-winded? What I'm going to do is I'm going to blaze through these document repositories about as fast as possible. And then I'll come back and I'll just yap on about things I think are worth knowing about them. Congress generates U.S. code and public law. You find U.S. code at uscode.house.gov and public law at congress.gov. The President gives us a variety of different guidance, including executive orders, which are published at the Federal Register, and then there's the Code of Federal Regulations at ecfr.gov. The President also has two important agencies covering the whole of the executive branch. The Office of Management and Budget at whitehouse.gov/OMB, and just make sure to go to the .gov site, and the Office of Personnel Management at opm.gov. And below this level, the repositories start to get relatively simple. The Department of Defense archives their guidance at Washington Headquarters Services with this cryptic URL. And the Army hosts their documents at armypubs.army.mil. All right, so that was the speed run, and now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. First, I want to explain why this matters and why you have to be careful with these documents. See, once you reach a certain level, a lot of what government agencies are doing have been directed in these documents. I mean, it's to the point where when somebody says, well, that's just the way we've always done it, usually what it turns out meaning is, well, that's what Congress told us to do. The reason this matters is because when the new general or political appointee shows up and asks why we're doing something, and all people say is, well, that's the way we've always done it, and then the new leader decides, well, that's not a good enough reason to do it, so we're going to stop, well, they might get away for a little while, but eventually the congressional staffers start crawling all over the place. So finding the guidance that tells you what to do, that's kind of key to avoiding that investigative misery. And then there is this caution about federal documents. Do not Google them. Or, at the very least, have the good sense to pay attention to what repository Google is actually sending you to. You see, search engines like Google are not really concerned with whether or not they're sending you to the most current version of a document. They're designed to send you to a link that has gotten the most traffic and that has the best metadata on the website. Official government websites, they tend to worry a lot less about optimizing themselves for search than websites like recipe websites. As a result, Google can send you to draft legislation that never became law, or obsolete regulations, or weird secondary sites. My personal favorite is that if you're looking for the Army's force management website, Google's top recommendation is the Vermont National Guard. Anyways, I want to hit some key points about these repositories that I just showed you. To get started, notice that Congress really has two separate repositories, one for U.S. code and one for public law. U.S. code is the official codification of permanent federal statutes. It's organized by subject with titles, parts, chapters, and sections. Now, the search features of this website are kind of limited. It works great if you know what title and section you're looking for, but if you do a text search, your results are going to be literal. If you search for active duty or active service, you're going to get different results. There are some unofficial secondary sites that might offer better search tools, but if you're going to use them to track down a particular section, I would recommend going back to the official website to confirm the current law. Now, one of the important things to understand about U.S. code is that it codifies permanent federal statutes. See, Congress turns out new laws every year, so-called public law, because these laws define the interaction between public institutions and private citizens. And of course, the repository for public law is congress.gov. But public law is organized sequentially, based on the session of Congress that enacted them and the order in which the president signed them into law. It's probably no big surprise to people who watch this channel that a single piece of legislation can be a bit of a dog's breakfast. There can be all kinds of weird amendments tagged onto a bill just to build enough support to get it passed. As a result, there can be dozens of pieces of public law that tinker with a single section of U.S. code over the years. As you can imagine, it would be a real nightmare to have to be able to track all those changes through all the public law. And that is why we have U.S. code. When a new piece of public law makes a change to something that's already in U.S. code, then that piece of U.S. code also gets updated. For example, here is the definition of the militia of the United States, and you can see that there have been 3 amendments to this section over the past 70 years or so. Granted, these are extremely minor administrative changes, but that just highlights the importance of the connection between U.S. code and public law. And before we wrap up this talk about public law, please consider this. Unless you are specifically looking for a piece of draft legislation, always do an advanced search for legislation that became law. The reason that this matters is because the House and the Senate will often initiate very similar bills. For example, the National Defense Authorization Act for a specific year. And so both the House and the Senate version of that bill, well, they're going to be available in congress.gov. But depending on timing and political factors, either version could end up being the one that gets enacted and sent to the president and becomes law. And the reason this really matters is because sometimes there's some piece of really juicy legislation in one of these versions that gets a lot of media attention. Lots of people Google the draft version, and by the time the other version gets enacted and becomes law, the search engines have become convinced that anybody who asks about this must mean that original juicy version. You can look pretty stupid reviewing the wrong document for your boss, but I wouldn't know anything about that. At the presidential layer, there's this broad point to be made. Congress leaves lots of, you call them gaps for the executive branch to fill in. Some of this comes in the form of authorities that the president can have access to if there's a declaration of a state of national emergency. Some of it is just guidance that Congress directs the president to create. And then some presidential guidance just deals with stuff that Congress is silent on. And DOD has their own robust set of guidance documents, but there can occasionally be some sort of presidential document that has reverberations through military regulations. Oh, and for those of you working in the National Capital Region, the OPM website has a nice feature where they publish the operating status of federal agencies. I'm not going to get into too many details about the DoD repository, other than to point out that they also archive canceled documents. This is kept behind a CAC wall, which I tend to like because it avoids that problem with obsolete documents floating around the interwebs. But the reason I point this out is for those of you who may eventually have to participate in a regulation revision for your service. You see, lots of times there's some Navy regulation that was effective back in 2016, and now that it's 2025, well, it's time to update it. Of course, that old 2016 regulation has dozens of references to DoD guidance that might have changed since 2016. So one way to identify any changes of DoD guidance that the Navy reg might have to incorporate is to do a comparison between the old versions of the DoD guidance and the current DoD guidance. And so this archive of canceled documents, it can be a real time saver. And then for the Army, there's just a couple of neat points. First, there is a category of document called an Army General Order. And this is not that general order that you had to memorize while you were in basic training. These tend to be organizational documents, assignment and reassignment type stuff, and some unit level awards. But there is a particular Army General Order that is worth its weight in gold for folks working at the headquarters. Its current name is the Assignment of Functions and Responsibilities within HQDA. This thing lays out what all the offices in HQDA are supposed to be doing both on the Secretariat and the G-Staff. Now, you'll notice that the document designation is 2020-01. Army General Orders are numbered sequentially within the year that they're issued, except for the Assignment of Functions. The Assignment of Functions is always number 1, and it doesn't get updated every year. Like, you can see how the current one was published when the last Secretary of the Army came in, and you can totally expect that there's going to be a new one with the new Secretary. Second, the Army publishing site has a couple of templates that are handy, especially the ones for letterhead and DA memos. And finally, the Army Publishing Directorate also maintains a database of acronyms, which is really handy when you first show up and start trying to figure out what everybody's talking about. I'm not going to promise that every acronym is in here, but it is a great place to start. Now, as I indicated at the beginning, this is by no means comprehensive. There are hundreds of federal agencies, and each one of them maintains their own repository, but hopefully you can see how to navigate through these things to get your daily work done. Now, if you want to understand the organization of the Army just a bit better, watch this video.